Thanks for being here today. We'd like to start off with land acknowledgement. I'm the curator of the Sheldon Jackson Museum, Jackie Fernandez Hamburg, and this is the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum's land acknowledgement that we start off with at every public program. We'd like to acknowledge and express our appreciation to the Indigenous people of Tlingit who have occupied this land for longer than any of us can imagine, and after 250 years of colonization in Alaska are graciously allowing us to share this amazing land with them. Thank you. The Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum make the Artist Residency program possible. They underwrite the program, and we're able to have this program through support of the National Endowment for the Arts, the Hanrahan Foundation, Alaska Airlines, Baranof Lodge of Sitka, and other entities and private donors. If you're interested in finding out how you can support the program, please look up the Friends of Sheldon Jackson Museum website or reach out to their office assistant via email. So we're pleased to have Lisa Kamahamak Lynch here. This is her last talk. It's her third talk since she's been here. She's been an artist in residence. She arrived June 10th and she started June 11th. Her last day is coming up on July 2nd. So come meet this wonderful Inupiaq beater, painter, and skin sewer if you haven't met her yet. See what she's working on. Elisa is an enrolled member of the Nome Eskimo community from Anchorage, Alaska. Her parents are Cheryl and Tim Lynch of Nome, Alaska and Buffalo, New York. Her maternal grandparents are the late Lawrence and Marianne Davis of Deering and Teller, Alaska. And her paternal grandparents are the late Robert and Ellen Lynch of Buffalo, New York. She was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska, and spent her summers in Nome with her extended family learning about her culture and traditions. She also spent time in the summer visiting her father's family in upstate New York and traveling the East Coast of the United States. She studied art history and classical studies in Rome for 4 years, and she is currently a pre-med student. And she somehow found the time to be an artist in residence at the Sheldon Jackson Museum in Sitka. So we're so pleased to have her here. And she's here to talk about a selection of cultural belongings or artifacts from the permanent collection at the Sheldon Jackson Museum. And she'll also weave in some beautiful stories about her family and share some images of her own work and her family's work. So without further ado, I'll give you Lisa Lynch. And do stay tuned for more residency programming in July with Neva Matthias, a Inupiaq grass basket weaver and doll maker. Thank you so much.
So I will be talking today about artifacts that have to do with sewing, both fabric and skin sewing. So today's name of the discussion is Sewing, a Means of Survival in Both the Ancient and the Modern World, an Overview of Artifacts. Before we start, we'll go over what skin sewing is. So it's the art of using animal furs, skins, or artificially tanned or naturally tanned leathers to make a variety of household items as well as survival items. Soon that definition of skin sewing evolved to later skin sewing was made with blending tradition and contemporary fashion to now be sold as a commercial item. So we'll go over a little bit later the evolution of skin sewing as a necessity for survival, then towards a necessity for economic reasons. And here is a picture from the mid to late 1940s of my Aka. So Aka in my dialect of Inupiaq is the oldest female member of your family or the matriarch. So in my lifetime, she was my Aka because I knew her before she passed. And her name was Etta Toktu, and she was a very skilled seamstress in both fabric and furs. And in the photo, she has 4 of her children with her. She has 4 little girls, and all of them are wearing clothing she made. So everything in the photo, from all the parkas to the trim, to the hairbands, to the mucklucks they're all wearing, she made all of that, including the leather for the belt that she's using to hold the baby. So if you look over her shoulder, there's a baby in the hood. We call that amak, which means to carry the baby inside your parka. So she made all the ruffs, she made all the mucklucks all the little kids are wearing too, and made sure to even make a hairband for the older girls to wear. Yeah, so yep, and all three of the girls, they're all within like 1 or 2 years of each other, so they're all wearing their matching clothes. So you could tell they're all sisters. Yeah, and as early as the 1940s and even before that, we do have some like family history here, some documentation of skin sewing as an economic pursuit besides just more of a survival thing. So here is the 1940 census records from Teller, Alaska, and I cut out the pieces so you could see. So at the very top here where it says 4, it says Paul talked to, head of family 23, Etta talked to, wife 18, and Margaret talked to, daughter, who's a year old. So it's also very funny on the census for back then. They ask if you could read and write in English, and Margaret cannot because she is 1, but they made sure to put she's not literate. And then underneath that is the other part. It shows what job you do and how many weeks a year you work, since a lot of people were still living semi-nomadically. So Paul talked to my appa worked 52 weeks a year as a trapper fur business. And it doesn't specify that he has his own business. Instead, he just sells pelts after processing. And underneath that, 26 weeks a year, for Ed to talk to, her job is skin sewing and then parentheses fur garments. And it also doesn't specify that she runs like a brick and mortar business, but instead she sells things out of her house and does repairs for people as well as making clothing for family, not just her children, but she came from a very large family. She had 13 or 14 siblings, so also making sure everyone in the family had clothing for the winter. So in addition to her the commercial sale of fur items, she would also make sure her family was ready and everything, including her parents, her in-laws, and like all the new babies had furs. So we'll go over that again later about how fur sewing and skin sewing became a very valid way for women to make an income with the new system of economics in Alaska. And we'll go over what you need to do for skin sewing. So, well, you need an adze. It's a type of like scraper almost with like a more curved blade to it, where it's also has a nice handle. So they could be really large because you can use them for agriculture things, but it just means anything almost like a pickaxe, but more gentle. And then a variety of scrapers. You need needles, you need ulu of all kind, you need sinew, you need some sort of stretching board, and then you need something to stretch the skin with. These are the basic tools for anything. And you can see that's a photo of me during Furande up in Anchorage. So every February we have a festival to recognize the history of fur trapping in Alaska and the trading of furs to make items with. So my mom made the beaver headband I'm wearing. It's a headband because I can't wear a hat, it's too hot. So I have a beaver headband on, which people have never seen before. And on my jacket, I have attached a fox ruff that I made. And then I'm wearing wolf face mittens that my grandma and great aunts made for my mom and then got passed down to me. So now that we went over some of the basic tools, we'll go with the more ancient technique of how to get started for skin sewing and fur sewing. So this is the ancient or pre-contact, but a lot of people like to say before Western technology was used steadily and was ready available, like the artificial sinew or metal products. This is what typically people would have been using, and you could have used this all the way up to the 1900s, depending on how remote or small your village was. So here is a picture from the Alaska State Archives. It is 3 women working at a like a fur gallery place in Nome, sewing parkas and mucklucks to sell in bulk orders for people not only visiting and being tourists, but also for all the people who moved up there for the gold mine or have moved there to be teachers, because it's still undefeated. There is no fabric that could be made artificially or be found in nature that is warmer than the traditional furs we use for both parkas and mucklucks. So to get started, you're going to start by preparing the skin, and this is a colorized photo. It's from 1954, but the technique he is using is a very ancient technique. So in Northwest Alaska and Northern Alaska, we don't have an abundance of large pieces of wood as you would in the interior with the Athabascan for tanning the moose hides, where you would build a frame to stretch it. So in lieu of that, they use spikes that are carved from pieces of driftwood that you use to stake the sealskin about not that high, like 2 to 3 inches above the ground, because you don't really need it that high off the ground. You just need enough for the air to pass underneath it. And you go out and you stretch it while the hide is slightly damp, so that way it doesn't rip when you pull on it. And to pull on it, you could either, if you're very gentle, 2 people could sit on either side and gently rock back and forth to pull it, to stretch it. And you'll know it's stretched enough that when you feel it, the skin of the skin side will feel thinner than before, because if it's too thick, then you can't sew with it, because then it's going to be more, you're going to break more needles than it's worth. And so that's the purpose of stretching it. Also, because animals aren't flat, so there's gonna be little flaps and little wrinkle spots naturally on the animals and when they were alive that we need to straighten out for sewing. And as the fur gets drier too, you could also pull the stakes out too, like pull it further to make it stretch more, or you could take stakes out as areas dry more, and you try to do as little cutting as possible at this stage because you don't want to have holes and everything. And some people do the modern way with the frames made out of wood, but a lot of people still do this, especially with seal, because it doesn't take that long. Because it's so dry up there that the humidity isn't an issue because there's almost no humidity. And these are some of the first of the artifacts that we will look at. So for cleaning the hide and especially getting it ready to stretch, you're going to need a variety of scraping tools of different sizes and especially with different blades, depending on how hard or how gentle you want to work it. If you're initially going to start just cleaning it and to get the residual fat off, or if you're trying to get like residual just meat off of it, you're going to use a pretty hard scraper, like a pretty solid stone, like a hard, it not so much slate, but maybe the jade, which is harder, and jade is extremely common in Northwest Alaska. It's one of the biggest production sites of it in the world, and it's very common to have artifacts made out of jade. The only issue is they they do break and they're used mostly for everyday tools, so there's not a lot left over. And then with the introduction of metals, people stopped using jade right away, so there's not a continuing of that history. But we do have an example of the hide scraper on the one side with the jade that's in a rock. And that you could clearly see has been used really hard on the one side, so you could tell that probably that person, whoever used it, was the right hand dominant because they were really pushing on that right side. And the motion you use with the scraper is you hold it with the blade facing out and you just put it flat and you push outwards, and that will clean up if you're cleaning for animal residue or fat residue left behind, that will push it off like a very gentle razor blade. Or if you're stretching the fur, you would probably use like the more slate with a rounded edge, and that same pushing will help move the skin to keep stretching it if you don't have another person there to pull with you. So both these styles with the rock, like the jade embedded directly into the rock, as well as this other example. It is a little bit more modern because it is from the 1890s, but it's still the traditional slate rock style where you have a wooden handle it could be wood, it could be antler, it could even be ivory, depending on what is around. A lot of them, it works better with wood because it's not as harsh on your hands to keep holding. And especially you don't need a big piece of wood, you just need one big enough to fit in the palm of your hand for a good grip. And you use leather, made them reindeer, caribou, moose, whatever leathers you have on hand to put the blade in. And the blade is like a modern razor where if that one chips or anything, you just take it out because it's the same. There's a slit for it to be fitted. So if you need to replace the blade, you could go ahead and pull it out and put another one in and just retie it and keep going. So if you have it's good to have the good handle and then have a few blades on hand. And same thing with this one, since it's a bigger, more rounded shape for the blade part, you might want to use that more for pushing the hide out to make it bigger because it covers more space. So you don't have to push as hard with that one because you could feel through, like when you're working with the animal skins, you could definitely feel the difference. Like, oh, I'm pushing too hard, it's going to rip, versus I should push a little bit harder because nothing's actually moving, because you want to be forceful yet gentle because every hole you make is another hole you have to repair later on. So after we stretch it and pull it and make it the right size, we're going to have to start cutting it. So you're going to need different size ulus, or ulak is the plural of it, different size ulus depending on what you're cutting for. So we're going to start with the big ulus because this is what we're going to do for like the general cutting to get the shape down. This is where you would use like a rotary tool for if you're quilting, or just scissors because you're just trying to section out the fabric. So here are two examples of two different ways how the ulu could be made for the handles. And the one with the one that's labeled the rock ulu in the hands-on collection is actually one here at the museum. You could see and touch and everything. That's where I got the photo from. And although it has a slightly smaller rock blade piece, the handle is much bigger, so it's more comfortable. So if you're really cutting, like if you're cutting for like the body piece and you're like, oh, I need a yard of this skin, or I need to cut this into long strips, you would most likely want to use this one with the larger handle because it's easier to hold on to and it's less strain on your hand. But if you're making the more shape cuts, like if you're trying to like, okay, I need to cut the hood and I need this angle and I need to make sure it curves the right way, you might want to use the other slate ulu on the other side that has the darker wooden handle, because it's a little smaller than the main ulu that you use, but you're not detail cutting yet. You're just cutting the shape out, like the big round shape you need with this one. And it has the handle that's the same size as the blade, so you can control it better. So it's more of a precision cut. And there's many other sizes of ulus. A lot of it comes down to personal preference, like how big or how small. Some people will use like the little ulus that are only this big for the entire thing because they just like the precision of it. Or you could even use like a bigger one because it's like, well, I'm cutting out the strips for the fronts and the backs of the parka or the arms, so I'm just going to use the big one and go for it. And now that we've cut out the items we're going to make, we need to start sewing it together. So the common thread, the thread that's used all over the state of Alaska in all different culture groups is sinew, which is the tendon from the reindeer or caribou leg. And also sometimes the back strap, I believe you could use from their muscles, the tendons. And it is stretched out and dried, and it's pretty waterproof, and you don't need a lot because when you pull it, it can stretch and it's really durable. And here are two examples of how people would hold them and keep their needles and everything. So on the bottom object, the one that's the needle case, that's an ivory needle case with like the wooden cork in it, and inside would be a variety of needles. Because much like regular sewing with the sewing machine, you have the different size needles for different projects or different thicknesses. You would have a good handful, like 5 to 10 different needles, like the needles you like to use, the bigger needles for if you have a really thick section, or if you're trying to sew together multiple pieces of fur, like definitely at the armpit and at the shoulder seams, you're doing a lot of pieces together right there. So you would want to use a bigger, sharper needle versus something you do to put a cuff on, because it's pretty thin by the time you get to there, because it's not as heavy duty as like the armpit would be. And it has a little handle on it, so you could also leather it to like a belt or put it in a bag. The next to it is a thimble, so very important, keep your fingers safe, because since you are sewing through animal skin, your ulus and your needles are pretty sharp, so they could also go through your skin because it's going through the animal skin pretty easily. So a lot of thimbles are made with ivory because they're easy to carve and they're pretty comfortable. And the nice thing about ivory, because of the material that the elements that make it up, since it's like a molar or a tooth, if you really wear ivory a lot, especially rings and with the thimbles, because they're a ring shape, they'll actually mold to that part of your hand if you use it for enough years, because the oil in your body will help manipulate the structure of it. So especially like the really well-worn thimbles, such as the picture we have, it probably started out as a perfectly circular ring, but as you see, it's bent because it looks like it could have gone on the thumb. And so as whoever used it for how many years or decades, it could have flattened out. And it's also in good shape because if you don't oil ivory or keep it in a humid place, it will crack and break. So the everyday use of the thimble is probably what preserved it till now. And attached to it are some of the examples of the ivory needles. So those needles would have been what's shown inside the needle case. Another common needle would have been out of caribou bones too. So if you like whittle down and splinter off like the leg bones, that's also very common. And also jade for detail work for when you want to get little stitches, because jade could be sharpened to a really good point.
Do you know where the ivory came from that's used for the needle case?
No, but I do know there are huge walruses, so you can get some pretty long sections out of it, especially some of the tusks can be this big around too. And my grandma always told me that animals back then are a lot bigger than they are now. So yeah. And now that we've gone over the needles, we'll go over how the sinew is stored. So there is a big sinew spinner here that's also decorated with a story about subsistence activities. And you could see there's caribou, there's people with their fish, there's people following the caribou herds. And that spinner is how you would not only store, but also make the sinew. So think of it like a giant, it's not a bobbin, what is that, what you put your thread on? The spools, yep, it's just a big spool that you could use to store. And then also so as you're making it, it goes on like a spool. And then next to it is a picture of sinew, which is what I use. So it's not on a spinner, but you're still going to be using sinew for this whole project. And next to it is one of the coolest artifacts here that I think. It is a sewing kit that you could also see in the hands-on gallery here. Oh, the spinner is also, you could see it right in the museum's gallery on the Inupiaq and Yupik women's section. And in the section of and in that part of the hands-on collection, you could see this ivory sewing kit. So it's a little tube, much like the needle case, and then you pull it on one end where the stopper is, and inside is leather that has a needle with sinew, and then on the other end of the thread is a tiny ulu, a tiny knife, a little crease maker, and then a spot of a piece of leather like that big to put other needles in. And so it's almost like you could put it on a carabiner and be ready like our modern sewing kits, but it's a pretty old style one. So it's a very cute hybrid of like, it's not really like a curio like gimmick thing, but it's also like it's a useful item. Like when you go on vacation, you're like, I actually will use this later. It's one of those things. It's not as typical than what I've seen to have the different accessories hanging off on it, but it is very practical to have. And as you can see, there's even a tiny ulu on it, like I mentioned earlier. And that ulu, if it's sharpened, especially as it's the slate rock, you could still cut through the skins pretty well with it, even though it is small. You just have to push on it a little more. And then the one knife too, that looks more like what we're used to seeing for a knife blade. It could either be sharpened to a point for detail work, or you could also use it for making creases. Because like for quilting, before you cut, you definitely want to have a nice crease for things and you want angles to be nice and sharp. Yeah, and you could also do that with the tool next to it where it also looks like for thread cutting. Yeah.
That's a question. How big is that sinew spinner?
It's about like this, yeah, it's about like this big. So like big enough that you could definitely be working on it all day, but like not so cumbersome you can't travel with it because until like 1890s, 1900s, everybody was still pretty nomadic or at least semi-nomadic. So everything, even if it's decorative, has to be able to be packed up or, let sit somewhere for 6 months while you live somewhere else. And then speaking of detailed work, these are two more types of knives you could use. They're going to be more typical for cutting out the trim you've seen along the bottom of parkas. They're called kapak, and that's the fancy trim with half skin. In the old days, it used to be different colors of seal skin or different like squirrels, shik skin too, to make those little geometric patterns that parkas are well known for. So if you don't want to use the big ulus or even a smaller sewing ulu, you would most likely use one of these little detail knives, which they're pretty small. They're only about this big. It's smaller than a little pencil, but they're made with pretty sharp rocks. So whatever like whatever like the little tip of your slate rock that's really sharp that falls off, that's what you want to do. And it looks like the larger one here with the larger stick, but with the smaller blade looks to be with jade too, which is a very sharp object because you could really whittle it to a point, which is also why a lot of people like to use jade needles before the introduction of metal was pretty popular. And then another one is that small knife that looks more like what we think of as a knife. So it's just good for like making last minute cuts, or if you want to trim the hair down on something. If the hair is too long on the animal versus the leather, you might want to trim it with that. You could do that because you don't need to press it down like with an ulu. You could just hold it up and trim it if you want. Yeah, and so much like and that one has the blade embedded, and then the jade one, since also jade can shatter once it's whittled down to a point, you see there's the rope or sinew there. So if you need to replace the blade, all you do is you take it out of the fitted slot it's in, put the new one in, and just retie it back down for security. And that's your basic tools you'll need in the ancient or pre-contact world. And now we'll talk about the shifting of priorities in both sewing and in culture. So if you've ever taken a psychology class or read a book, you're probably familiar with this model. It's called the Maslow's what is it? Map, not triangle, levels of needs. So initially, what it is, it's the theory of humans and what we need to succeed and what we need to live a happy and healthy lifestyle, and different levels of like things we need. For example, it's like physiological is like, I need somewhere to live and I need access to drinking water. That's how I'm safe. After I have those confirmed, then I can move on to safety. I need to be around people who I feel comfortable with. I need to be able to provide for myself, either trade for it or hunt myself. And then belonging, I need to feel like I live in a community so I feel better. And then if I feel better about living in the community, I might feel better about myself because I'm not going to amount to anything if I don't like myself. And then wanting to learn, wanting to better yourself, or even wanting to help other people, learning about them, Then that's the cognitive level. Aesthetic level is taking pride in not just how you look, but how you live and where you live. And that leads to self-actualization. And what Maslow thought was the peak is transcendence, living a fulfilled lifestyle. And at the turn of the century in the 1900s, as the idea of capitalism was permeated and actually was sticking more in Alaska, even though Alaska did do a lot of trade with Russia before the sale of Alaska, it wasn't really integrated into the everyday lifestyle of the indigenous people. But after the shift of being sold to America and now having to participate in not just boarding schools, but also churches and community towns, and now having what people say is a more stable lifestyle or just not so nomadic, they needed to start doing other things besides fulfilling physiological needs. And one of the easiest ways that the people were able to convert it was first, skin sewing was the physiological need, where I'm sewing first because I need to survive in my environment. I need to be able to stay warm, and I need these for safety. I need this not for safety. I need this for survival only. This is only a physical survival need. But as they realized, they also could sell them, which is the safety. Having an economic safety net is, so the skill I honed in for survival, I can now use the skill as a means to gain economic capital and earn salary or earn like commissions. And that way I can be more secure of where I live, and I don't have to change much about my lifestyle because I'm already sewing. So now I could sew for money or sew for trading for like the local stores. Like if I make the store owner a new parka every other year, I'll get like 6 months worth of groceries or trades like that. And so as time goes on, the culture shifted from I need to sew these furs or else I'm going to die of frostbite to now, in addition to now having a house that I paid for with the skin sewing, I also can make a living out of this. And so that takes us to the modern age of fur and skin sewing. So it's still practiced for traditional reasons too, but a lot of people have now expanded it to selling for items for sale or selling to other people. So here is a modern way of doing the preparing the skin or fur. So this is the fox that was eventually made into my ruff. So my brother has a powerlifting rack, and he was not using it this winter because he wasn't feeling well. So I used the powerlifting rack and some rope to stretch the fur out after me and him pulled on it together. We pulled on it, and then you could actually use a can, like a can of like green beans or corn, and use the lip of that to push on it instead of the ancient skin scrapers. And so after we pulled it out as far as we can go, because I needed it bigger than the fur already was, is when you buy a fur, they're already tanned and everything, but they're not stretched because who knows if you just want to display it or just have it in your house. It's not sewing ready. So if you do buy a fur, you have to prep the fur, much like the people would do with the stakes in the ground for the sealskin. I tied the fox to the poles, much like you would if you were doing the Athabascan style of the moose tanning. And every day I would go in and check on it to see if I need to tighten the ropes on it to pull it even more as it got more and more wider. And then a trick that I did learn by reading about like for moose hides and everything is I added a weight to the end of the fox to pull the face down too. So you could see the string where it's like a triangle, and then there's the head, there's a rope going straight down. That's a very tiny 2.5 weight, like a tiny little dumbbell, like for Pilates, tied to a rope that's just pulling it all the way down. And I knew the fur must be done stretching when the dumbbell was finally on the ground, because when we first tied the fox up, it was above the ground, and as it stretched and got bigger, the dumbbell suddenly was on the ground. So that's how we knew, oh, it's all stretched out. That's as big as it gets, and it didn't rip anything. And I was able to use the armholes and leg holes, so I didn't have to create extra holes in it. And that, yeah. And then if we're going to start cutting and planning the ulu, not the fur, you're going to use ulus still because they are still the best instrument for cutting through different furs. And unlike the ancient or pre-contact ulus, these ones are made with metal. And what's really cool is I like the example of the one on the right where you can still see the teeth of the saw blade, because all of the original ulus that you see made out of metal from like the late 1800s all the way up till now, they're all made with old saw blades. And so you take a saw and section it off to make the traditional blade, and some of them still have the teeth on them. And some people like that side with the teeth, how you see the one side is smooth and one side has teeth, because you could turn it on the side and use the teeth to rip something really quick. And then because it's a saw blade, it's meant to be sharpened and used for cutting wood. It's already really easy to sharpen with just a flat rock or a river rock. And so these are both examples of the larger ulus we would use to cut for the skins in the modern age, being 1890s till now is what I'm going to refer to as the modern age. And then the smaller one that has the ivory handle too is sharpened to a point where you could see at the very bottom of the ulu, at the bottom of the semicircle shape, there's a little light gray versus the dark gray, and that's where it's been sharpened very well. Most ulus are sharpened on one side really hard, so that way you have a dull side and an extremely sharp side. So if I'm working with furs, I would definitely want to use the really sharp side so I don't have to do any repeated cuts. And then now we're going to go on to sewing. So these are things that I do. I'm not an experienced skin sewer. I'm still learning. I do a lot of things, but one of the things that I still use is much like everyone else, I use sinew whenever possible. So a lot of people still buy and use sinew. And if you don't have real sinew, you could easily buy imitation sinew, which is the little information there. It's actually from the bead company store in Anchorage. You could order it in bulk and you could get 300 yards for $15.95, or you could get it in black with 300 yards for $16.50. And one of the tricks that I learned from my grandma who told me about, and my mom who told me what my aka would do, is if you're going to buy the imitation sinew, one more step to ensure that it stays nice and stiff is you actually get a bar of beeswax and you do a coat of beeswax over your thread and then you start sewing after you've coated it in the beeswax, because beeswax is actually an old tailor's trick to make sure your stitches are nice and stiff. And people who do a lot of beadwork will also coat their beading thread in beeswax first, so when their beads are on, they'll stand up, especially people who do 3D beadwork, so the beads are nice and stiff and stand up. And then much like the big ivory needle case, I carry my needles actually in a little glass vial that's the same shape. So that way I don't lose them and they're in a nice little container that I don't have to worry about because it doesn't take up a lot of space. And now if I'm going on to detail work in the modern day, I'm going to use, a lot of people still do use the sewing ulus. I just haven't found one yet that I like, because it all depends on like what size you want, how heavy you want it, what kind of handle do you want. I still haven't found one. So for little detail work, like if I'm working on really thin skins like the rabbits, I'll probably use an exo knife of all things or a box cutter. And if you notice, the exo knife is also the same shape as the jade knife used for the detail work. And the box cutter is also really good for making little sharp angles there because it provides a good grip. And because they're razors, they also provide a really clean cut, since a lot of time like metals are like metal scissors or metal like knives used to cut the fur aren't that detailed. Yeah, so those are the details. And then for this last slide here, I have an example of all the beadwork you see with all the different flowers and the big hair barrette and everything, the sets of two. Those are actually all done by my aka, my great grandma, whose census record I showed at the beginning. So those are examples of all of her beadwork and how they're all done the traditional way. And then as a cute tie-in, the picture next to it is a pin I made using the same methods, just with new beads. And it's a pin that has the same design. She didn't have any of that style, but it's the slipper top design that's extremely common. And after this, when I was making this presentation, the theme is times may change, but things stay the same. So just because centuries and decades have gone on doesn't mean the technology has to shift and change with that. Sometimes it could be improved, like using the metal instead of rock for the ulus, but a lot of the time things such as the thimbles made out of ivory or sinew and the ivory and sealskin, and then the sinew are things that are here forever because they are the best way to get the job done. So even though we're centuries apart, I'm still using the same techniques and the majority of the same materials to create the same objects, but just I'm in the 21st century and they're in the 14th, 15th, 16th, whatever century. Comments, questions?
How many items did you find at the Sheldon Jackson?
Quite a lot, and then a lot that I did include because they were just things I was looking at that I was like, oh, I want to look at these needle cases. I want to look at this box, but I'm like, oh, they're not for the presentation. I just want to look at them because there are multiple drawers here that you could pull out that's just all sewing stuff. So there's the different ulus because I picked 2 ulus for both the modern and the ancient time, but there's literally like 15 to 20 of each, and I just chose the 2 that I liked or showed like the difference between uses, like the most drastic difference between them. So there's a lot of inspiration here, especially for sewing, since it's such a huge part of the culture.
When did you start sewing?
I didn't actually start sewing until a few years ago, but I have done embroidery for quite a long time for my life, and doing like embroidery, cross stitching is a big part of my life, and then doing other arts like drawing and painting really helped like hone in those like fine skills, because I always remember seeing pictures or like hearing my grandma talk about like my Aka doing all the fur sewing and skin sewing, and then watching my grandma do some too. And then the biggest thing is my mom is a great seamstress. So growing up watching my mom work with, she could like make a quilt in like one day or like a cusbuck in like 3 hours. So she's like, so watching her do that too. So
Did you make yours?
no, she did.
Oh, she did.
I don't make, yeah, I don't make anything with cloth.
Oh, you don't.
I was like, why do I need to? It's my mom can do it
Yeah.
for me. She's so good at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do. So then I was like, well, if my mom does everything with cloth, maybe I'll learn how to do everything with fur. So that way we never have to go shopping. We have everything at home. Yeah. Yeah, my next project I want to work on is making the sealskin slippers because I have a pattern. I just need to sit down and do it and get the sealskin. Yeah. And then any questions online or?
Are you able to market in Anchorage?
Yeah, there's like there is a good group of people that do like to buy things, and especially as more people like move into Anchorage too, from also the villages, people want things, and then it's also hard because not a lot of people know how to skin sew anymore. Not a lot of, it used to be you could find like 12 people in like 10 minutes who can make slippers, but now hardly anyone does. It's normally like 1 or 2 families left, especially like in the Nome area that I know of, where it's like you have like you have to be on like the first name basis with whoever you buy your slippers from, because they're normally the only person who does it. So their wait list is like a mile long. So there is a market because there's just so few people left to do it. So even little things like I would make rabbit earrings a lot, like big rabbit pom-poms, and those would sell really fast because nobody makes anything with fur. And I was like, oh, well, those were just like a for fun thing while I'm sitting at the table, but I guess I'll start selling them now because a lot of skin sewing and fur sewing is being lost because it's just not as many people wanting to learn, or it's just also pretty inaccessible unless you already know how to tan and trap for furs, because it gets pretty expensive. Especially if you're not selling it and you're making it for yourself, you're like, well, I'm gonna have to commit to like $600 in materials. And that's a lot. But if you use it for your whole life, like it's intended to be, it's worth it. But you just have to be able to be like, well, I'm gonna front like $600 for this project. And that's just the fur. Who knows about thread and machinery stuff or needles and how many hours? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so if you do really good work, you got a pretty good captive audience and you'll never go out of business.
It's still mostly online.
Not so much. I do a lot of pop-ups, so I do a lot of like market days and craft shows and everything, and that's more fun. Yeah, I like doing those.
And Lisa, you're from a really talented family of people who sew.
Mhm.
Are you related to Bobby Brower? Is that she your second cousin? Or
No, so she's my cousin's like super good best friend, and like technically we are related like 5 or 6 generations back, because she had one great grandparent who was from Shishmaref, and who know, people didn't keep records, but we're probably related because like my Aka had like 15 or 16 siblings, and she came from a big family, and then Bobby came from a big family. Like, we're probably somewhere, you know, we're probably second, third, fourth cousins once removed, who knows? But yeah, I do know her, and I was really fortunate enough when I competed in the Miss Weo pageant, I was able to wear a parka made by her that what she made for her sister. So that was really special to be able to wear that and present it to the judges and the audience. Yeah.
I think there's a
Hi,
question.
Lisa.
Oh, hi, Carmen.
Hi. Yeah, now that you mentioned Miss Weo pageant, I'm so proud to see you and see how your life is going. It was very nice to meet you back when you ran for Miss Weo pageant and see your travels to Europe and all that. So thank you very much for sharing all this wonderful information, and thank you to Sheldon Jackson Museum for sharing as well. I really
Oh.
appreciate that. I think I heard you say one of your relatives is from Deering, and that's
Yes.
where my grandparents are from as well. So we're probably related somehow or another too.
Yeah.
And the we have a lot of sewing people in my family too. My mom and my grandmother both sewed. So thank you very much.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you're able to join in.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, my grandpa's family is all from Deering. So my grandpa was born and raised in Deering and did all the reindeer stuff there, then moved to Nome as an adult. Yeah, so that's very cool.
Just want to say thank you so much for sharing about your sewing and about the pieces that spoke to you from the collection storage room and also from the gallery from things that are on exhibit. And most of all, for sharing about your family and your experience and your background. We appreciate you so much, Lisa.
Yay, thank you for having me.
If you have not visited with Lisa yet or met her in person, you're missing out. You can come to the museum, please do before July 3rd and get an opportunity to see what she's working on and just visit with her. It's been so great to host her, and thank you for being at this presentation, everybody, and we will see you hopefully soon at Neva Matthias's table for one of her presentations.